born in Camden, Maine, where he currently resides, focusing on his studio, his young family, and the third generation operating a family farm and orchard. He received his BA from Hampshire College and his MFA from Yale. Gideon's a faculty member in the graduate program at BU, and prior to Boston University, he had many teaching and visiting artist appointments, including Brandeis, Hampshire College, Maine College of Art, Maryland Institute College of Art, Kansas City Art Institute, UW, I'm an alum, sorry about that, and the New York Studio School. He's been the recipient of an ART award from the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation, a Purchase Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He has exhibited at the Alpha Gallery in Boston, as well as Stephen Harvey Fine Arts Projects in New York, both of whom represent his work. Plain Space Gallery in New York, Barry Whistler Gallery in Dallas, the University of Southern Maine, Space Gallery in Portland, Maine, and the Halsey Gallery at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, as well as the Center for Maine Contemporary Art, to name only a few. On April 20th, his next solo show will open at Stephen Harvey Fine Arts Projects. And this summer, he'll have a show at Perimeter Gallery in Belfast, Maine. So if your travels take you that way, please don't miss that. And everyone, please join me in welcoming Gideon Bach to be a stage.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. I've had a lot of friends come through here and everyone raved about it. Looking forward to seeing all of your work and getting to know you. I wanted to start by showing a few paintings and talking a little bit about painting in general. These images I'm showing aren't necessarily my favorite paintings in the world, but they're painters, or my favorite painters in the world, but they're painters that I deeply admire and mean a lot to me. I could show 100 more painters that match that description as well, but I wanted to focus on these to begin with. On the left, as you probably know, is Frank Auerbach, and on the right is Jenny Dubnow. Frank Auerbach is a British painter. Jenny Dubnow is an American painter working in Brooklyn, New York. I felt drawn to bring these two together mainly because they're both interested in an idea of different types of painting moments. On the right, the Jenny Dubnow is investigating the kind of moment that has to do with photography, but more specifically with video imagery that is paused in between, sort of in a state of transition between one moment in a person's expression and another moment. She goes through, from what I understand, her studio practice involves going through and videotaping friends in a sitting and talking to them and watching them talk and just kind of engaging them, and then going back over the video frame by frame until she finds a moment that has the criteria that she's looking for. And the Auerbach, from what I understand, is involved with a different kind of painting moment where he has a sitter sit over and over and over again for years at a time, builds up the paint surface, scrapes it down, builds it up to kind of search for what I think of as, and some of you who do portraits know what I'm talking about when if you've read the Giacometti book, A Giacometti Portrait, where he very quickly gets a sense of the person, and then for the rest of the painting it pretty much goes away. And the sitter keeps coming back, the painting develops and develops, but that kind of elusive sense of the person underneath the appearance of the person is gone and replaced by something else. I think along the way he achieves something much deeper than what was there before, but it's that kind of sense of the person that he's going after. And I should say also that along the way, whereas the portrait itself, the portrayal of that person, winds up just kind of being a byproduct of the process, the perceptual process. What builds and is most kind of palpable in his paintings are the kind of solidity and sense of the specificity of that room, and exactly the distance between him and the sitter, and how that space feels. It becomes solid, becomes kind of a sculptural space, in my opinion. This is another Auerbach and Dubnow. This is Ann Harris on the left and Elena Sisto on the right. And I put these two together mainly because they both start from what I understand their studio practice involves starting the painting as if they were an abstract expressionist painter. They're purely thinking about formal issues, moving the paint around, color, the kind of modernist space. And they work the painting up that way, and eventually an image emerges from that process. And then my understanding is they follow the cues that image gives them. And it results in these very curious takes on an idea of portraiture. Again, on the left is Ann Harris, on the right is Elena Sisto. And Harris's paintings wind up seeming very often like self-portraiture, because the figures often take on kind of what's going on in her life. She made pretty remarkable paintings about when she was pregnant and giving birth to her kids. I recommend looking them up if you haven't seen them. Kurt Kauper, someone who kind of pushes down the expression of the painterly expression in his paintings as a way of kind of, well, to put it a different way, I kind of think of the expression, the way that a painter responds to what he or she is looking at or representing, or if it's an abstract painting, what is kind of coming out of the process as kind of a screen. Each mark is part of a screen through which we see the image, the space, the idea, and so on. And some painters like Kurt Kauper push that screen to the point where there isn't quite so much interaction with the voice of the painter, and other painters like Giacometti and Auerbach. It's much more kind of, you're very conscious of the artist's voice and the artist's kind of thinking through every moment in the painting. But what the reason for that, I think, with Kurt Kauper is that he's engaging very much on a pretty complex bunch of ideas that have to do with critical theory, cultural history, the male gaze, and all of those ideas, in order to kind of to have greater meaning, need to be as clear as possible. And for that reason, I think that these paintings keep giving and giving and giving, deeper and deeper ideas the longer you look at them. They're very strange paintings to see in person and to confront, because they keep getting more mysterious the longer you look at them, like all good paintings. Ridley Howard on the left and Ellen Altfest on the right. both of these people deal with a different, with painterliness and a physicality of paint. But it's a, it's a very different, again, kind of painterliness than like Leon Kossoff or Frank Auerbach, but it's just as physical. In the case of Ellen Altfest, it's a kind of hyper-focused attention to every square millimeter of the canvas, so, to the point where it becomes like a physical sensation in the viewer. And with Ridley Howard, it's kind of a manipulation of the color to create a kind of washing, sensual color situation that's a little bit like a James Turrell sculpture. Todd Bienvenu. I particularly like this painting because it reminds me of Leon Kossoff's swimming pool painting series, which I like very much. Todd Bienvenu, I don't know if you know him, he's a contemporary painter, again living in Brooklyn. Angela Dufresne brings together just an enormous world of different ideas, cultural, a lot of them having to do with bringing together film history with critical theory, queer theory, a lot of different ideas with a very strong kind of painterly, within a very strong painterly world. Ewan Uglo and Catherine Kehoe. Ewan Uglo died fairly recently. Catherine Kehoe is still around. Enjoy these paintings in the kind of compression of focus, and they're every bit as painterly and sensual as the other painters that I love, but in a very different kind of, it's a very different sort of way of reading a painted space. This is Louise Fishman, who has been a huge influence ever since I started getting more serious and focused about painting. One of the things that I particularly enjoy, or was meaningful to me about her work, was that she seemed to kind of take all of the rules of abstract expressionism and invert them and sort of press into the space of the painting rather than build out. I'm not explaining that very well, but she, put simply, she works subtractively in an aggressive way that seemed to become more painterly than the additive way of painting. One of the reasons that I brought the paintings in, and that I'm talking about all of these painters in terms of a screen through which, a screen of kind of expression through which we see the image and the ideas, is that most of the time while painting and while looking at painting, I'm just thinking about what's happening with the paint itself on the surface, sort of abstractly, whether I'm, making a figurative painting or looking at a figurative painting or something. I'm much more interested in how the painter put the paint down. And I think that, that, for example, what's really surprising about seeing a Vermeer in person is how painterly they are. They don't seem like it in the photographs, but you see every little thought that he had in every moment throughout that painting. And it's really one of the main things that interests me about painting in general, is how painting can be one image that you can take in all at once, like a photograph. You can get the idea in 1 second or a millisecond. You get a sensation from it, but it's made up of thousands or maybe in some cases millions or hundreds or whatever of moments in a painter's life. Every mark, every scrape is a clear thought. And so that's all of these different moments in time put together in one image. So in that way, it can kind of come apart and become a time-based medium, or it can become a still medium, depending on what the viewer brings to it. So anyway, going back to when I was first kind of getting interested in painting, before this painting, I was much more interested in, or before this, I'm not happy about this painting. This is sort of in my undergrad time, but I was really interested in music centrally. I was a musician focused on music, and I didn't really want to major in painting or anything, but I kept getting drawn back to it because of the classes were much more interesting than the other classes that I was taking. So art classes were central to my studies because of the fact that each painting kind of wound up getting harder than the last one, more challenging, more interesting. And the teachers that I was learning from, namely Denzel Hurley, Riley Brewster, and Judith Mann, would blow my mind every day, whereas the music classes just seemed to be, at the places that I went, seemed to be about honing technique and seemed anti-creative in some way. But one of the things that also became more interesting to me was the idea that the formal issues of painting could become much more interesting than the subject matter, what I thought of as the subject before. When I talk about subject matter as distinct from the subject of the painting, I'm talking about the chair is the subject matter, whereas the subject is something else. Most often it's this elusive thing that you can't quite put your finger on, but that you can see, that you can get a sense from the formal issues coming together and from the way the paint is handled. And I couldn't really make sense of that until I started working in a series. So working in a series in this case, I made a painting of this chair in the corner of my studio, and then I just made another one, and another one, and another one. And I thought in this way that I could force myself to push the paintings and push my boredom to the point where I would do something with the paint that kind of pushed me out of usual habits, and also hopefully start to kind of confront or as a way to kind of address the things that were really interesting me in the abstract expressionists that I was interested in. So I made a bunch of paintings of this chair, and what I saw when I hung them up next to each other was, it was the same subject matter, but the subject within each painting was very clearly different one from the next. And that was really exciting to me. Does everyone know what I mean by subject versus subject matter and formal issues? Formal issues? So formal issues, when I talk about that, I'm really talking about the, as opposed to like an image or symbolic meaning or something. Formal issues are just line, color, value, dark and light, surface, space, basically abstract issues that painting classes are very often taken up by talking about formal issues and how strong they are, what they mean, etc. As as a way of pushing what I was doing with the paint and incorporating my social life into the studio. I would invite my friends in, give them coffee, give them beer, or whatever I had, and just have them sit and read or talk, play guitar. And I told them not to sit still, that it wasn't a portrait. I was thinking of them as portraits, but what I would do is I would just force myself to follow all their movements with the paint at whatever cost, and it forced me to kind of loosen up and explore what the paint could do. And I would most often paint over them when they left, or paint them out, scrape them out. And I was intrigued by the fact that sometimes the painting held some sense of that person in my mind. I don't know if it did for anyone else, but it did kind of get me out of the idea of making an image for the image's sake. And also, it allowed me to kind of engage with the idea of improvisation, which was something that was interesting about music, but that I had, up to that point, had a hard time incorporating into my artwork. So that was in undergraduate school. And in graduate school, I continued working this way, but became, at this period, a little bit more scientific about it. I forced myself to, any time someone came in, I would try to follow all their movements. And anytime someone kicked something over or moved something, I would move it in the painting and try to hold on to all of that information. And as a result, the spaces, the paintings kind of dissolved under the weight of all of this information. I was also getting an enormous amount of critical feedback for the thick paint, because the paintings got very thick. So thinking about Louise Fishman and some other painters that I was interested in, I worked subtractively. I started working on a lead white ground, which is just a beautiful surface to work on. And so I wanted to maintain the luminosity of that ground, so I worked in what wound up being a lot of kind of glazes, translucent color, and scrapes and scumbles, and it was a lot of fun. These are terrible slides. They're from slides, and the information didn't translate very well, so I apologize for that. That's one of the reasons that I brought in the catalogs, because there's a lot of images in there that will give you a better idea of some of these paintings. I'm going to kind of bang through these a little bit more quickly. If you have any questions about any of these, let me know.
What size are you working in?
This is fairly large. This is, for me, fairly large. It's about 7 or 8 feet wide, but most of them are pretty. I have had a kind of standard size of about 55 by 57 inches, about kind of body size, or not body size, but field of vision size. But a lot of them are smaller. One of the earlier paintings is very small, about 3 inches. That's about as small as they get, and the biggest paintings are maybe 8 feet or so. That's the case with this one. Around this time, I started to get interested in, how much the space could dissolve under the accumulation of information, and how I could find different ways of getting specific about the color or the drawing or the placement of an object, how that could kind of anchor the space and bring together, make the information around it suddenly sort of snap into space, like that cup on the amplifier right in the middle there. I kind of rendered that, and that had this way of kind of pushing things back and pulling other things forward that hadn't made sense before. And generally speaking, the things that were not there for very long were loosely rendered, and then if they got kicked over or something, that's how I left them. And the things that were there for, like that chair, for example, was there for a while longer, so it got more fully rendered. I tried to be sort of scientific about it. Just jumping ahead to a studio I had these big windows that I faced, so all of the light, anytime the light changed, it would basically like working on a landscape painting. Anytime the light shifted, it would change all the color relationships in the space and outside the space. So I had to work in a different kind of series where I had a different painting for each different type of day. And this is one of them. This was also around the time where I started using direct measurement as a way of making sense of that back wall of windows, which looks like it's kind of bowing. Direct measurement, what I mean by that is I would hold up a measuring tool like a brush or something, and what I saw was what I would directly put onto the canvas, so that if I was working on a painting this size, then everything would kind of splay out in a way, because it was falling into several different perspectival systems of recession. Am I losing anybody? It basically would get a little bit fisheye lensy, because it was like as if you were looking at the fenestral picture plane, they call it, the picture plane that, in the Renaissance had a vanishing point here, and it was all clear, all lined up with a vanishing point, as if you kind of pulled your head out the window and were able to look around. Suddenly you could see 3 or 4 different vanishing points. And that's basically what happens when you open up the picture plane, when you widen it. Unless you're doing something like this. This is a big painting, but I was making the window panes, for example, much bigger than they appeared to me, so that wouldn't happen. This was a different way of dealing with that problem of the light changes. Every different kind of day was represented in a different window pane. That was fun because I could explore different ways of putting the paint down. I worked on this for a while flat, and I would pool the medium in those little window panes and drip paint into them. It was a lot of fun. Same idea. This is the first time that a record album cover is in a painting. That's Last of the Mohicans by Bow Wow Wow. If any of you know that record? It's the band set up as if they were Déjeuner sur l'herbe, the Manet painting. It's great. It was really fun to paint because of the reference, but also it was just really satisfying to render that, leaning against that wall, because I knew exactly where that wall was, because I know what a record album looks and feels like, exactly how thick it is, and so that was kind of a double referent. It was a spatial referent and a cultural referent. But you had to know who Bow Wow Wow was. You had to be 14 years old in 1980 whatever to know. So it's for me, I guess. So this is kind of a better example of that, what I was talking about kind of opening up the picture plane. You see right at the bottom of the painting, I'm looking down at that book that's flat on the floor. That's pretty much where my feet were on the, that's where my feet would meet the picture plane, right at the bottom. You can see you're looking down at the box and the bottle and the book. And then you're looking up at the top of the painting. And it was wide enough where that shape on the left, you can see it better in the catalog, but the shape on the left is the edge of the painting coming into the picture plane. Is that pretty clear to everybody? It's a diptych. I was completely obsessed with Annunciation paintings at this point. It's the left panel. Then I got obsessed with crucifixion triptychs and also the Garden of Earthly Delights. So this triptych was kind of a rumination on that. It's a terrible image, but there's a better one in the catalog. So I should say there are a lot of figures kind of buried and hidden in these. Some of them you can see. It's a studio I had in Brooklyn, New York. And I guess this was one of the ways that I was trying to kind of deal with that, looking in several different directions within one picture plane. As you can see on the extreme right, I'm looking down at a wall that's directly on my right. That the white strip on the right is a wall that I could pretty much touch like this. And then there's a kind of extreme, you can see it going off to a vanishing point right. There. And then this wall is going to a vanishing point over here. So I'm looking in whatever that is, 100 degrees. Basically, there are two vanishing points within the one thing, but what I did was I didn't distort the horizontals at all. What that thing at the top would do and the beam, a lot of the sort of verticals and horizontals would do ordinarily would be bending and bowing, and I straightened them out. So here I'm looking pretty much straight down at the bottom of the picture plane and up, and on the sides it's pretty fairly wide, but then there are some of the horizontals and verticals that I'm straightening out. And the records on the floor were kind of a way of trying to make sense of that floor plane that otherwise didn't make any sense at all, because there was no grid on it that I could follow. So when I would be listening to records and I would just put the record that I was listening to on the floor as a way to kind of try to make the drawing of that record cover help the floor plane. It was a little bit of a crazy space. Our bedrooms were meat lockers in the back that when you shut the door, it was this resounding boom, and then you couldn't hear a thing. It's great for sleeping though. This was a space I had in Portland, Maine, with this bright orange floor and bright yellow walls. And it was two different spaces. You can see, well, hopefully you can see, I'm standing in the doorway This is about this big, 55 by 57, and I'm standing in the doorway, and in order to paint the room like that, I had the painting in the other room. But I really wanted to kind of paint that shape, whatever that shape is. It's kind of, you know, a diamond shape that's open at the bottom. So again, as a way of kind of trying to make sense of that floor plane, I'd use a lot of records that I was listening to, and I was really getting into the just the painting of the records themselves. And this is a drawing I did in that same, that's the orange room there. You can see the left side of the drawing on the right side of the drawing, if that makes sense, going down the wall. I just had this huge piece of paper about 10 feet long along one of the walls, and I would just draw the space and move down the wall and just keep drawing the space. Of course, as I moved, all of the drawing that I had just done would distort completely. So it was pretty strange. A lot of those extraneous lines you see are sort of attempts to try and reconcile that problem. This is me standing in the middle of the door jamb. And on the right is the orange room, on the left is the dingy room. It's the dingy room. It's my palette in the foreground there. This is an ink drawing I did in the other room. You can see the drawing on both sides actually. That the right side of the drawing is visible on the left side, and the left side of the drawing is visible on the right side of the drawing. That makes sense? Standing in the doorway now, you can see the drawings on the wall there. As I'm looking down this wall is the graphite drawing in the orange room and the ink drawing in the other room. Oftentimes the paintings that didn't really do anything for me, I would move to another space. I moved around quite a bit during this period, and so I would take the failed paintings and just overlap the new space on the old paintings. The hope was that if I got the drawing right, when I looked at, say, that turpentine bottle in the foreground that was in the space number 2, the overlap space, then the light and the drawing of that, if I did it right, would make you see the other elements of space number 2, and if you move to the object right next to it, if it was painted in space number 1, clearly, then you would see that in relation to the other objects of space number 1. Sometimes that worked, and sometimes it probably didn't. So this is the space I have had in Rockland, Maine for a bunch of years. It's a big falling apart ballroom. And the rain pours in through the roof when it rains. There's no heat, but it's an extraordinary space. It's huge. And this is, you can see the Guernica poster at the bottom. That was kind of another way of trying to nail down that floor, which was otherwise just a kind of veils of drips. So it's kind of like in the studio, I'm very often kind of wrestling with how do I kind of, how important is it to maintain this seduction with what the paint is doing when it's clearly taking away from the clarity of the space, sort of always a balance of those issues. And, or hopefully it's a balance. The paintings kind of fail if it's too much on one side or too much on the other. All of these paintings go for a long time. Most of these paintings go for a long time. The shortest being maybe a couple of months, and the longest 10 years or more. But I do switch paintings around quite a bit.
Do you ever play with accelerated perspective, thinking of anamorphosis?
What is that? I don't know. Accelerated perspective?
It's when an image is placed in such a way that it appears to be indecipherable, as though it were melting because your perspective stretches it. And if you look at it with a particular mirror that's in a particular tone,
Like the
pulls it up. Yeah, it's in whole body.
yeah, the skull.
Yeah.
No, I've never done that, but I'm fascinated by that. I thought, do you do that?
Oh, years ago, I became very interested in that. And you're doing something very different, but you're also doing extraordinary things with perspective. I mean, you're giving multiple viewpoints all at once, and there are moments when things click into place, only to demand that one look again. I mean, they keep shifting.
Yeah, no, I've never done that. I do. The closest I come to doing anything like that is when I'm painting a glass, or a lot of times if there's old glass and a reflection in the old glass, and I have to kind of forget what the thing is and just copy the shapes that I see and the color and the value. And if I get it right, it looks perfect. It looks right. But if you think at all about what the thing is, then it's lost. And I think of that in terms of like how those artists made those anamorphosis images. Like they must have had to just get completely in the zone to be able to do that. So I bet they're fun to do. Seems like it would be. So this is a painting that took a very long time. It had been just the lower panel, and I worked on it for a long time because in this studio, the light, when at a certain time of day, the golden hour, when the sort of raking light hits the building across the street, it fills the space with this just amazing light. And so I only worked on this painting at that time. So I worked on it for years and years, and it was really fun. But I really wanted to get the ceiling, which has these rosettes, I think they're called. They're basically vents, but they're beautifully carved things, and so that's looking not quite straight up, but whatever angle that is, 45 degrees or something, up above my head. And the beam that you see curving up above it is actually a straight beam, but because of the perspective, because of the vanishing point on the left and right, it's kind of bending around like that. So that working in this way seemed like one way of dealing with that problem, the perspectival distortion that happens.
How big is this painting?
It's about 70 or 80 inches, something like that. And it's small. The top panel is smaller just because I just grabbed another failed painting and put it on top, and because I wanted to sort of deal with that ceiling. But I really liked how it worked, having the kind of smaller panel on top. Oh, you know, I was going to read a quote at the beginning. I forgot. Mind if I read a quote? This is from Frank Auerbach. Someone sent this to me recently, and I thought it was really good in terms of what's good about painting. That's really hard to talk about. I think all good painting looks as though the painting has escaped from the thicket of prepared positions and has entered some sort of freedom where it exists on its own and by its own laws, and inexplicably has got free of all expectations. Possibly the explainers will catch up to it again, but never completely. I think the never completely is what it's all about. The element of mystery in any really good painting is something that it's just, yeah, obviously it's not something you talk about, but it's the thing that, you know, you can talk about a lot of different elements of the painting, but if it doesn't have that mystery, it's fallen on too far on one side or the other, I think. So that mystery is something that I would try to, I would hope gets in there somehow, but anyway. This is a diptych that was at a different space, and then I overlapped the Rockland studio. I think this is the first time that the light up globe in the middle of that blue kind of ball is a light up globe that's really fun to paint. It's a globe that lights up from the inside. This is a series of, it's a multi-panel series that I did from 3 different areas in the studio. I basically set up 3 easels and palettes and would just shift around and work on each painting and then put them together. Because I was mostly interested in the way that the space would become illusionistic within the panel, you know, illusionistic space, and then get to the edge or the seam between one painting and another, and it would just be abstract shapes and forms, color, line, formal issues, and then go back to illusionistic space. So these became one day triptych that I would switch the panels around like that, and then one night triptych, and I'd do the same for those. It's a diptych. This is the panel on the right is looking back towards the area where I painted in the panel on the left. Does anyone know the artist Stephanie Pierce?
Yes.
That's Stephanie Pierce playing that guitar there. Has she come here recently? Get her, she's really great. She's very cool. So this is sort of a sister painting of that one you saw earlier. I want to do another version of it, and I had another a different format, but another long sort of panoramic view of the studio. But I wanted to have this one be a little bit taller so that I could paint the whatever that thing is called, directly above my head. So that topmost panel is looking straight up, and on the bottom panel, looking from the extreme right to the extreme left, is almost 180 degrees, but not quite. This one took longer. That's the two of them together. So I was going to say there's a different resolution to that dilemma that I was talking about before, with the bending. Do I bend it, or do I let it just break apart? And so this is kind of what do you call that? A different take. There's a word I'm forgetting for some reason. So around that time, I was invited to do a show, this alternative space in Maine, that has an interesting program, and it's called Perimeter Gallery in Belfast, Maine. And since it wasn't such a commercial gallery, I wanted to do something different and decided to do a wall drawing, which I liked the idea because it was sort of built into the piece was its own temporality. I was going to just work on the drawing every day during the run of the show, and then on the last day of the show, paint over it, or erase it and paint over it. And I particularly liked the idea of it being a show that changed every day. So if people came in one day, the drawing would be different, and then they came in another day, it would be completely different. And this, I thought, worked in this space because of the kind of community that surrounds this place, or the kind of people that would be interested in that. I wouldn't really work in the same way at just a regular commercial gallery, I think, because people tend to go see those shows and then that's it. Anyway, so this was really quite exciting for me to do, because it allowed me to both invest more, because I knew that it was going to just go away, because it was completely, because I wasn't going to have to carry it around anymore, or worrying about selling it or not selling it, and I was going to destroy it at the end. It, in a weird way, made me care about it a lot more. Not in a weird way. It made me care about it a lot more, but it also allowed me to take different kinds of risks. And what was really fun is how it incorporated directly the space itself. For one, this is all vine charcoal, I should say, and that much vine charcoal on a wall really changes the light in a beautiful way. It becomes kind of velvety. I went through a lot of charcoal, but it was a lot of fun. And that dilemma of perspective that I was talking about really sort of, I was able to deal with it in three different ways. You can probably see the lines of recession that are straight coming up from the left and right, and they're also bending as well. And then where the ceiling met the wall, there was this kind of interesting direct mirroring that would happen with the patterning on the ceiling. It's fun. It's a detail. The owners of the gallery had a little girl. I think she was like 4 at the time, and she would come down and draw with me. She'd draw on that side of the drawing. You can see some of her drawings over there. And that's her drawing. That's me drawing her drawing on So, around this time, because I was thinking about perception and the perception a lot, like with this wall drawing, I was thinking about how perception and perspective come together. And I got kind of obsessed with the idea that this was it was a temporary piece, obviously, and it was site-specific, but it struck me more as a sculpture than a painting or drawing. And part of that was the way that it confronted the actual sculptural space. By sculptural space, I mean the space that we inhabit, as opposed to illusionistic space that a painting depicts. So the drawing itself had this kind of sculptural presence that my paintings didn't. So I was interested in maybe making a painting that confronted that in some way. And it's a painter that I deeply love, Sylvia Mangold, and she explored this through this series of paintings, I think in the 70s or something, where she would paint a ruler within the space and the ruler on the edge of the painting. In this particular one, I think that ruler is in perspective in the illusionistic space of the painting. But there were some paintings that she did that I, for some reason, couldn't get an image of online, but she'd do the ruler in perspective and then do a trompe-l'oeil ruler. Trompe-l'oeil means fool the eye, if you don't know that term. It's when artists will paint something in a way that makes it look like it's actually in our space, just stuck on the wall. So she would do the same ruler, trompe-l'oeil, on the edge of the painting, so that there was this conceptual and visual flip that happened while you were looking at the painting between our sculptural space and the illusionistic space. That was enormously exciting to me, and I wanted to deal with that. I should also say that I was invited to do a show that was kind of a second take on the wall drawing show at this other space in Portland, Maine. And they got a grant for me to be in residence for that. So with that space, it was this interesting music and art space, kind of an alternative art space. And I wanted to do something different for that too. And I had been getting more and more interested in the record, in painting the record covers. Excuse me. So I cut up a bunch of panels that were 12 and 5/16 by 12 and 5/16, the exact dimensions of a record cover, and set up a French cleat system on the back of them, and just did this series where I would listen to the record and put it down on the table and paint it, because I wanted for there to be that kind of visual conceptual flip between our sculptural space, you know, the parameters of the object is the same as the parameters of the depicted object. And I don't know if it happened for anyone else. Every once in a while it would kind of happen, but these other issues kind of came up for me with this project. One of the issues was that the records in the paintings often seemed too tall, and they also seemed kind of to bow out at the bottom or something. Does anyone see that? They kind of bend out, but they're perfectly straight lines. And what I later realized was that I was, you know, measuring very carefully and trying to get all the measurements right, but I was drawing the lines in the painting straight when they actually curve just slightly, because I'm looking down and the record is close enough for me to be looking down at the front edge and in perspective at the back edge, just slightly. So that's why they look like they're bending out, even though those lines are perfectly straight. Felt kind of stupid afterwards, but it was once, because I feel like these are lessons that I keep learning over and over again. You know, when I'm conscious of this wall and I'm looking at an object on a wall, on the floor, I see it tilting this way. But when I'm conscious of this wall, I see it tilting this way. It would happen all the time when I'm painting. I'd take measurements and everything, and I'd draw this, paint this thing on the floor, and then I'd take measurements and paint it again, and it was tilting the other way. And it, you know, it's very simple, but kind of in the, when you're in the process, when you're in the zone, it's just kind of like none of it makes sense. It's very confusing. So this project, initially I wanted to do 333 of these things. And it was really fun to just kind of go in and bang out paintings. And part of the reason was that my first daughter was born around this time, and or was about to be born and then wasn't born. And I did not have much time in the studio. And with those other paintings I was working on, I would just be getting warmed up after, you know, an hour, after 8 hours or so. But this way I could put on a record and make a painting and leave if I only had an hour. But what then later became really fun was kind of curating, you know, thinking about influences of one record on another, and then later kind of arranging them, curating them in fun ways. I didn't make it to 333, but I think I lost count after a while, but it's definitely, by now it's up around 300. So those are the wall drawings. One of them on the left is kind of a combination of the kind of, whatever you call the intuitive perspective maybe. I was just sort of drawing as I saw things, and I was allowing the lines to bend, but also following through the straight lines. With the one on the right, which is graphite, the one on the left is charcoal, one on the right is graphite. I was following every line using string and straight edges and stuff to where it met the wall. And what was interesting is that the way that when you combine 3 different perspectival systems that way, it does the exact same kind of bending as it does when you're just doing it sort of intuitively. That's the big wall of records. This is an earlier version of the painting that's over there, the bigger painting that's over there. These are the more recent paintings. See the light up globe and stuff. This is the going from left to right. And each window is a little bit later in the day, to the point where the farthest right one is right when the light is about to kind of turn black outside. It's a studio I had in Boston while I was teaching at BU. is pretty much the end. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I was just wondering, we talked a lot about like Frank Abagnale, but I think a lot about Cezanne influences in your work, because with this like lived experience kind of perspective. And I'm thinking about too with the relationship with like Marley Ponce's essay on Cezanne's doubt. I'm just wondering, do you think about like as a subject of work, would you say like this phenomenological experience of a space, like this lived experience, like what would you do you think about phenomenology when it comes to your work, or how do you, I mean, I just see that a lot with just the way, you know, again, this skewed perspective of
Did you say Merleau-Ponty?
Marley Ponce, yeah.
Yeah, I love
Cezanne's
Merleau-Ponty.
doubt, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just surprised you didn't bring up like the whole still life of the apples, like the, you know, you talk about Arbok, but yeah, so you do think about, I guess, phenomenology when it comes to your work, or how do you see that playing?
I do, yeah, I mean, Merleau-Ponty is probably the biggest one that directly relates to what I think about. It's interesting. I don't bring him up because I can't talk about it. I can read about it and I love it, and I love thinking about it. I kind of love the experience of going through a whole book or something, and then kind of ingesting it, and having it be part of what I'm thinking about. But it's I have a hard time talking about it. Maybe it's because like when I'm in the studio, when I'm just working on the stuff, it's just kind of like experience, and it's like painted experience. But then seeing someone so beautifully talk about that is crazy for me.
Yeah.
Another one, have you ever read Panofsky?
No.
Erwin Panofsky? He's not so much phenomenology, but he kind of went pretty deep into perspective. So those two kind of, the perspective and perception ideas, I think were really great.
I have a question too about the album series. I was just curious, like, 'cause you left them in perspective, right? You said they're like laying down. I was just curious with the decision between painting it in perspective and then also just painting it as an object. Is it because, like having it to be edge to edge, like the actual size, like it fit the size of the frame? Was that decision because you wanted to create more of like, again, the painting? Because I mean, your paintings are very much in the painterly history of, you reference a lot of paintings within your paintings. I was just wondering, was that decision because of like having the painting as a window and versus the painting as an object, or what was your thought behind the perspective?
Well, I guess I just wanted it to be both. I wanted to see if it could be both for me. I've been doing some record paintings lately that I think are a little bit further along in that idea than those. But I initially wanted there to be kind of like this tension between them being the object depicted and I wanted to basically see the thing depicted as being this sort of the size. This is the size of that thing, for there to be this kind of thing that went on. And I don't know how successful that was because the other ideas, pop culture ideas and things like that kind of took over, but also just kind of the mass of them. They kind of work better on their own in a way, but I really like seeing them, just a whole bunch of them. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, yeah, I was just curious about your thought process behind the perspective versus, being more object-based.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to kind of do that thing that Sylvia Mangold was doing, where she was like, this is this, and this is this now, for there to be, because that, for me, that kind of duality opens up so much in terms of ideas and possibilities, and a kind of a different sort of way of entering a perceptual painting for me. That was really exciting. So, I think that's pretty much it. Yes?
When you use a diptych and triptychs, when you like physically fracture the picture plane, did you see that difference in how you like organize or compartmentalize the perspectives? Because it's really, I mean, when you are working on, is it, do you feel different? Like there's real like a separation. The other ones it seems to be like meld the two spaces together to sort of negotiating like some other spaces. And I was wondering if that triptych is really, there's a cut. And how do you feel different or?
Well, usually, I just start a painting like this. This is actually a diptych to, that's either the right or the left panel, and that's the other panel. I just kind of decide I'm going to work on them as a diptych or triptych, and I start a painting, and then I start the other one, and I put them together and see how they work. And then maybe I make changes, or maybe not, but very often I don't know if this is what you're asking, but very often the horizon line is different, so that kind of creates a weird tension or fracture. And this is another triptych. This is what I'm working on right now. It's the metal panel. That's them together. I'm not sure if that's what I'm
Yeah,
answering.
I think I think more of like when you're spending that much time in the space, as you're painting along, like do you like shift your role or in the world? I mean, just as painter painting in the studio as opposed to friends visiting your space, and it seems like that spatial sort of like a lot of different perspectives. You're like putting it together and sort of like negotiating the world. It seems like, but I don't know if it's a question or just something I noticed. But when you're painting that long time, do you start to sort of see different roles as a like painter or artist?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, working on a painting for 10 years, it's like it becomes about so many different things. And I think my interests change so much. And the paintings always kind of hopefully hold a little bit of every one of those changes. And the records actually allowed me to kind of just make one thing be about one idea, and because a lot of the painters that I was really interested in at that time were really quick painters, really, like Dana Schutz, who I was obsessed with at that point, works very quickly when she's working on the painting. She spends days mixing her palette, but then when it was my understanding of her practice, when she's executing the painting, she does it as fast as she can, and that's why she spends so much time mixing the palette, so that she doesn't have to stop and worry about that. Yes?
My question is similar. I see this kind of like aggressive, like laborious nature to the way you're making your work, and I was wondering why do you feel this draw to like trace every movement of like the things that are happening in a room? Why is like it's very meticulously done? What drew you to this? Is it something that just developed over time, or was it some
You mean like like this, or like the ones from grad school?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the ones from grad school are what I'm thinking about, but these ones also, sometimes there's like this trace of like a history or like time passing within the painting. I'm just curious, like, where that came about.
Well, like in the grad school paintings, I was purposely not worrying so much about rendering things. It's just kind of documenting where something was and where it moved, just to sort of as an experiment, if anything. But then, like, what happens a lot is that people come and hang out for a while, and I paint them. Maybe I don't paint them completely, and then they go and I paint the couch they were sitting on, so that I paint it over them or something, so they look kind of invisible.
Do you feel like a painting can have like an element of time within it?
Yeah, definitely. I like that idea. I mean, the idea of like time passing, like this object is here, but it was over here. You know, that implies that someone came and moved it. Maybe the person didn't stay long enough to be painted, but you know, there's evidence of human habitation. Or this person is here, but they're also there. They're wearing the same stuff. It's the same person. So that kind of like one of the things I'm really interested in terms of that is the way that Chinese landscape painting and pre-Renaissance Italian paintings kind of use the same, they basically do that same thing where this figure's here and it's also over here, so it implies a story rather than a fixed image. So is that getting at what you're talking about? Yeah. But they all, like with the pre-Renaissance Italian paintings, they also kind of skew the perspective so that it kind of changes where the viewer is in relation to the spaces depicted in the painting. So it's kind of like sort of physically moving the viewer rather than implying that the viewer is fixed. I really like that idea, the relationship of time and space and how that can exist in a painting.
Gideon, thank you for sharing, and thanks
Thank
also
you.
for bringing the paintings, because that'll allow this conversation to continue for the next few days. So much appreciated.
Absolutely, thank you.